Sir, it's 11. I'm starting, sir. Before I begin, I request, except the speaker, everyone to kindly please mute themselves. Good morning to one and all, and a warm welcome to C3's Institutional Dialogue and Book Conversation on Engaging China, Indian Interest in Information Age by Mr. Pavitran Rajan, sir. To introduce a topic, information warfare, in its broadest sense, is a struggle that began with the advent of human communication and conflict. Over the past few decades, the rapid rise in information and communication technologies and their increasing prevalence in our society has indeed revolutionized the communication process, and with it, the significance and applications of information warfare has tremendously increased. The control of data and the ability to analyze it has become the new driver of economic growth and productivity among states. It has also accelerating the redistribution of economic power in favor of Asian states like especially China with the advent of new age technologies like 5G and artificial intelligence. To deal with this topic, we have an expert with us, Mr. Pavitran Rajan, sir, an alumnus of the prestigious National Defense Academy. He is considered a thought leader in information warfare in India and regularly writes for various publications and also advises various central and state government agencies, including the Indian Armed Forces. While serving in the army, he did pioneering work in cyber intelligence and information warfare. After taking voluntary retirement in 2013, he served as an advisor for the Ministry of Home Affairs, Government of India. He is also an adjunct faculty at the Cyber Security Research Center, Punjab Engineering College, Chandigarh, and serves on the board of advisors of the E-Raksha Research Center, Gujarat Technological University. A warm welcome to you, sir. And we also take this opportunity to congratulate on his newly released book on the same topic, Engaging China, Indian Interest in the Information Age. Thank you very much, sir, for taking time out to be with us today. With this, I would like to hand over to Commodore R.S. Vasan, sir, Indian Navy retired, Director C3S, for opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
A very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and honor to have Mr. Pavitran Rajan with us. He's not new to us at all. As you all are aware, the Chennai Center for China Studies, the Press Institute of India, and the Institute of Contemporary Studies, Bangalore, have joined together to bring about greater awareness in terms of trying to understand China in many, many landscapes. Media was one of this. So, in fact, after the curtain raiser 2 months ago, we had one which was dedicated to cybersecurity. The whole idea was to understand, where we stand vis-a-vis China, what more can be done by India, and particularly the kind of thought leaders Pavitran Rajan and his team are able to tell us what more can be done. If you can tell people what to do only when you understand what is the reality. So it's from that point of view I considered that his talk earlier when we invited him for the cybersecurity capsule was thought provoking because he was not only calling a spade, he called a spade a bloody shovel. We need more people to call a spade a bloody shovel because only then will we understand the importance of what we are trying to gauge vis-a-vis China. So even during the cyber security capsule that we had earlier, we realized that there are many, many chinks in our armor. Not just technology. Now, technology was one part of it which was discussed earlier, but there are also procedure, there are bureaucratic delays, there is a lack of understanding of the complexities involved. So all this, unfortunately, today has brought us to a state where China has an active, proactive method by which the state-controlled media works on many cylinders. All of them are firing, firing at their optimum efficiency. Whether it is the social media, whether it is Xinhua, whether it's People Daily, whether it is Global Times, whether it's the foreign minister who is in a forum, or the Chinese diplomat who barges into an Australian room telling them what to do. So all this is part of a campaign as far as China is concerned to let loose this monster called information and use information as a tool for achieving its nation's objectives, state objectives. So unless you are able to understand what are the dimensions of this information warfare, not related to technology procedures, but people behind that, the brains behind that, and the target audience which is there. I think last time it was Mr. Rajan who mentioned about information, disinformation, misinformation, and information for the sake of information. So, there are many layers of this information which needs to be addressed. And today, with the widespread use of technology, we realized even during the pandemic, more and more people have taken to the internet and the media. So it becomes a primary focus of trying to understand what's happening in the rest of the world. And therefore, there's information in the open domain which can be manipulated. And there are agencies who are tasked to ensure that information is manipulated. It's also part of the psyops. So we are very happy that in not just living at one conference that we had, for looking at China's landscape, we are carrying on with this to understand the dimensions of information warfare even more. So the book of Mr. Pavitran Rajan has come very handy, which is just being released or has already been released. So we're very happy to have him with us to tell us more about his own understanding, because he's worn the uniform and he's been in MHA and he is now a current thought leader. And all this makes it very important to listen to him carefully and see what future challenges we are likely to face in this domain of great importance to our national security and objectives. Thank you, and over to Rajan.
Thank you, sir, for a very good, let me say, I'll put it that, a very good introduction. And thank you once again to the C3S for having me back and giving me an opportunity to talk about this monograph. This monograph actually was commissioned by another think tank called the Policy Perspective Foundation, headquartered in New Delhi. It is, I would call it more or less an intelligence think tank or the deep state think tank, because they've got, Mr. Halder, very prominent, former director of IB as the director, and a whole lot of people who works from an intelligence perspective. So it was sometime last year when he gave me a call and told me, Pavi, I would like you to write a monograph on China and how India can be relevant or cope up with what we see about China. This was before the standoff at the LAC. And I, I took it as an opportunity and I said, okay, fine. And I started writing that. I finished it off in about 3-4 months and I submitted it back to Policy Perspective Foundation. But by that time, the LAC had hotted up and, they held it back for, best reasons. What they would, they felt that the timing was not right for the, release of that particular monograph. It's a very slim volume, below 100 pages, but they had given me specific tasks. So I concentrated on writing about, this particular subject, not from an information warfare point of view or a China point of view, but from an Indian point of view on how do we stay relevant. Now, Commodore Watson also correctly, told me that I speak very bluntly. Because I have studied communication very closely. We are a multilinguistic, multicultural society. And if you speak even slightly euphemistically, what the other person might grasp out of what I am trying to communicate will turn out to be wrong. Because in my long, small, 20 years of 2 decades of, service in the Indian Army, I had heard multiple lectures on information warfare and cybersecurity by a huge, I would say a queue of people in uniform who had come to tenure that appointment. Not that he was an expert, but he became an expert because he was tenuring a particular appointment. And I used to try and sit and listen to them and try to discern what they were trying to, convey to me. And to be very honest, a lot of that did not make a coherent picture in front of my eyes. So when I got an opportunity, I then said, I need to not speak euphemistically at all. I need to speak very bluntly and I need to speak the truth so people can grasp, what I'm trying to convey. So that might be the reason, sir, why you say that I call it a bloody shovel. But the aim is to call a spade a spade. Now, fair enough. So Bala, he saw that the book was released on 10th. And Bala saw it and then immediately called me, said, so since he must have seen China, because the name of the book is Engaging, China. So I understand why he immediately said, "Oh, we would like you to." And I said, "Okay, fine." I took it up over there. So, and Bala also later on called me and said, "Sir, I hope we are creating a presentation." Okay, because time has been very limited. So I sat together in the morning and, culled some pictures from my book and put a presentation. So Bala, can you please show it so that I can introduce this book to
Sure,
this
sir.
very august audience?
Sure, sir. Is it audible, sir? I mean, it's visible, sir?
Yeah, it is becoming visible. Yes. So is there no way of it only showing as a book? No. No,
Yeah,
the
it's just showing
presentation.
as a book, sir.
Oh, okay. So it's a slide. Okay, fine. Fair enough. So fine. This is fine. Everyone can see it. So that's cover page of the book. In fact, I visualized it, and it was translated by a very talented digital artist called Vijesh.
So sorry to interrupt. 1 minute. I'll just mute myself, sir, because I have to change the screen.
Okay. Can I go ahead? I can't now. That's the issue of these things. Okay, I take it that I can go ahead. I can't see anyone anymore. I can only see this presentation on the screen. So yeah, now I can see you, Bala. So there you are. So I then designed this cover, and Vijesh translated my vision into this particular jacket, because when I started reading up on China, to find context, everyone has to go back into history. So I did, go back into a little bit of history and trace the origins of the civilizations of India and China back to the classical age, which also was the time when Rome, the classical antiquity, is the age where Rome was, a great empire. And the Westerners always look back to Rome as they're one of their, from Greece and Rome as one of their founding, worldviews of the world. So to give it context, so what has happened is there are many civilizations which has all formed around river valleys. A lot of them have, collapsed, declined, and today most of them have been subsumed by under the Western, and then the Islamic, civilizations. The Arab civilization has, come as a religious part of it, but they have been subsumed under the religions of, Christianity, which is which is seen as a Western concept, and the Arabic part of it is seen as the Islamic concept. But the two civilizations, China and India, which is from antiquity to modern times, they have survived, and there are reasons why they have survived. It is not that they are exceptional civilizations. Okay, and they were superior civilizations because of which they survived. They survived because they occupied continental, areas, and their population depth was big enough that neither the Western invasion or the Islamic invasions or influence could subsume them. Many other, civilizations like the Persian, and maybe many, particular, all of them slowly, got subsumed under the larger Western or Islamic identity. Now, when you look at China, I studied it geographically, and I went into, because to give a military man has to understand the geography first, because if you look at human history, the evolution comes of humankind. Bala, I'll tell you, okay, this is fine, leave the slide there, but I'll tell you next slide when I want that slide over there. Okay. So when you look back and you look at why does a culture or a civilization have a particular flavor, a lot of that has got to do with the geography. So if you are in an area which is fertile with, abundant grain and richness, you will develop a particular culture. If you are in a place which is cold, where most of the time, you have to work very hard for the summers and earn, plan for the winters, you will develop a different culture. If you are near the sea, your culture might slightly change. If you are in the deserts, your culture might change. Otherwise, the Homo sapiens basically last 300,000 years where we have been in existence, is more or less a very uniform species. Culture is, is because of the geography which is involved. So when you look at, China, I found very unique patterns, which although I had studied about China as a military officer, but when you look at it academically, you look at it from a different perspective. And I've tried to capture it in this particular book. So why does China behave the way it behaves? This was something which I was trying to convey to, because we usually try to buy into narratives which might not be our own. So China is widely seen as authoritarian. Yes, it's a one-party rule. One party, but the leadership has changed, except for Mao and now Xi. The leadership has changed. So they have got an evolution, and it is not a kingly, right which is given. So if a man is being given power, it is because adequate number of people are convinced that he needs to be given that power. That is how society works. Because unlike times when kings were given godly blessings to rule, today that phase is gone. So if a particular person has acquired power and he is managing to hold on to power, it's because the power structures of that nation is convinced that he, as standing as a symbol, needs to stand there as a symbol. So I take you back to another 100 years. A very famous admiral called Admiral. Typical popped up of that. Okay, fair enough. My screen, something had popped up. All connected to the net, no? Okay, I think that should get rid of it. Okay, that should get rid of it. Okay, fine. So I'm back. When you take yourself back 100 years, the Westerners were ahead of their time. The Anglo-Saxons, okay, the Anglo-Americans, the American is a inheritor of British power. They were much ahead of their time, and they were ruling the globe. So when an elite class gets imperial power and starts to rule a globe, they are in a comfort zone which you and me cannot imagine. Okay, wealth is there, power is there. Now they are looking for perpetuating that power. Here, we do not think about it in that way, because since we were colonized by the British, we have lost a strategic culture. But when you have a strategic culture with an imperial, domain under you, the elite classes start thinking in a different way. They are not thinking about daily grind of life or things like immediate things about the economy, etc. They're very comfortable. They're only looking for perpetuating power. And so there you have Admiral Thayer Mahan, 100 years back, writing what he did. He looked at the map of Asia, and he saw a gargantuan nation, okay, with 400 million. At that time, 400 million was quite a concentration of population. India was not recognized as one nation by the Westerners at that time. In any case, we were a dominion. And what he said is, when this mass of people gets Western scientific technology, they will be very, very hard to contain. They will be a formidable power which can threaten us. And there they started planning. Mahan wrote about why we need to plan for the defense of the Pacific. They went for the first, if you talk about China, everyone is aware there is this first island chain. There is a second island chain. He's planning for the defense of US from a China 100 years before, China reached where it has reached today. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So my worldview of China was, they are 95% plus is a Han Chinese. I said, how did such a ethnicity grow to such a gargantuan size? Because when you look at the history of China, they have also faced multiple invasions, like all civilizations. China, for the majority of the of its recorded history, has been the victim of invasions from the north, the Mongols. They've even been dominated at some time by Tibet, Xinjiang. These are all places where has come and dominated the alluvial plains of when you look at the south, when you look at the east and the south, that is where the populations are concentrated. So people have come, but they have slowly, the syncretic nature of the Chinese civilization subsumed the invaders, and they became another member of the Chinese. Like if you look at our population, we may not recognize that over millennia where other tribes have come and invaded and occupied us, today they are seen as other class of Indians. Our original inhabitants are Adivasis. Okay, only some of them left in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands now. But we ourselves have become Indians, and our ethnicities have mixed in the great population of this, and we have got subsumed into the larger this of India. Likewise with China. So although in China they they have today in the Han Chinese, that is the majority of the population, but they have clearly created buffer zones for themselves, because Mao and the PLA, when they took power, they, being a military body, immediately understood that the heartland the buffer zones had to be taken. For us, because we inherited power or were gifted power, and the people who inherited were lawyers, they had no clue of the need for buffer zones. They were more worried about things about human rights and the great equality of man and non-alignment, area blessed with idealism. Mao and people were very clear. They realized that China had suffered 100 years of humiliation, which is one of the founding narratives, because they saw in the last 400 years of Chinese history and the years before that, the history of China is different. After the Western powers came and the British, imposed in the first Opium War, a humiliating defeat, out of treaty terms, they slowly realized the coastal allies started becoming richer by trade with the Europeans. And for the first time in the history of China, the Han Chinese themselves got divided into the rich coastal plains, coastal elites, and the poorer cousins in the hinterland. And they noticed this particular danger, that they're interested, and there was a whole lot of rebellions which took place because of the taxes which, the Westerners had imposed on the emperor. Unlike India, they were not actually occupied by a colonial power and very systematically, divided, or their education system changed. They have a continuous bureaucracy and an education system, and they have got their own, narratives and written records which date back to 3,000, 4,000 years. We have lost quite a bit of it. Because of these things, China behaves in a particular way. And if you look at, the American or the Western narrative, they always, when they started trading with China and started allowing it to rise against Russia, they always said that when prosperity comes, China will get democratized. Now, that is a very simplistic statement. What did they mean by, they will get democratized? They immediately knew that the people who will become richer initially will be people from the coast. Those elite are unlikely to stick, will have different interests which will blossom compared to the hinterlands. And they knew that is one way we can get China back under control, because it is only by internal divisions of the Chinese population can the West again put, pressure on China. As long as they remain as one state, under one political, the West would not be able to, create problems for China. Now the CCP realizes this, and that is the reason, if you look at it, they have maintained, although they allowed people to become rich, they allowed people to become capitalists, the Chinese elite population has an idea that the weakness of China is when you allow it to, split. And that is the reason Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. very, very, touchy subjects in China, because the same ethnicities out there are under a different political system. And the coastal elites get attracted to that. They would like to have that same freedom, because their interests now are no longer with the hinterland of China. I hope I've given a slightly different twist to, this is my, study in the last 4 months when I written this book. Next slide, please. So here, this slide I had shown before, but I'll again go back to it. Why does China behave the way it does in the South China Sea? Because Mahan foresaw and created the first island chain, a planned strategy in which Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, all those nations bordering South China Sea have been carefully cultivated and been allowed to rise by the US to hem in China. Okay? And China is a trading nation. Their economy is so dependent on trade, and all the trade happens through, the vast majority of that trade happens through Malacca Strait, dominated by Singapore. And the US Navy, a much more powerful Navy, can always choke it and bring China back to its will. So what is the Chinese trying to do? They are trying to push the US Navy away from the coastal areas beyond the first island chain by creating those artificial islands. They also foresaw that we can't, they try to create another, canal over Thailand. They have created the CPEC. They have created, road infrastructure via Burma into the Bay of Bengal. They are not doing this to actually, target India. They are doing all this to protect themselves and to pursue their interests, to break out of Western domination. We have started noticing the, string of pearls, etc., which they are creating, basically to protect their sea lanes of communication, and feel that it is being targeted in India. We are targeted because we are there. Okay, but their aims are not targeting India. They are planning to get back into their preeminent position, which they once enjoyed in the globe, along with India. India and China were the fulcrum of the globe before the Western powers, got bought in enlightenment and industrial revolution. So they are going over there. And there it comes. If you are trying to, in this book, I've tried to capture, and I have tried to say that if you do not understand what are the driving imperatives which run Chinese foreign policy, you will draw the wrong inferences. And your response will be so curated that it might not be the right response. For example, if China is creating the CPEC through Pakistan, it is to, if it is to bypass the Malacca stranglehold, which they feel is threatening their national security, what should be the Indian response? If India, what is our declared aims? We would like to recapture POK, because those are our ancient trade routes into Central Asia, which is being hemmed down, because the British clearly, when they, there are a lot of evidences which are today coming up, because the British have declassified, papers of the partition, where it is more or less very clear that the Britishers, it was not Jinnah, but it was the Britishers who, funded Jinnah and created Pakistan. And they ensured the northern regions were with Pakistan to ensure that India doesn't have access, because they needed access. The Indian leadership did not, at the time of independence, listen to the Western powers who wanted to have bases in India. The Pakistan army and the Pakistan state accepted this, joined the CENTO and CETO. So they were okay with Pakistan having that particular northern area with them, so that they have access to the Central Asian republics. So if your stated aim is to get back POK so that we have access to Central Asia, we are in direct conflict with Chinese aims. So I proposed as a slightly controversial this as foreign policy, that in pursuing a modus vivendi with China, we need to offer them alternative land routes to the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal. That will make it more attractive than going through a CPEC into Balochistan, which is mountainous terrain where it can always be interdicted. But this price should only be given if they settle the border issues and fund the Indian economy. So I proposed that in my particular book. And those underlying reasons of why China is acting, the BRI which they're creating is got a strategic purpose, it's got an economic purpose. So if you do not understand what are the strategic and economic purposes for which they are creating it, we might react in a wrong way. Next slide, please. So there you are, the digital Silk Roads. I had, in my previous talk too, I had mentioned about the Chinese have realized that the domain of cyberspace, which is an artificial construct created by the US, which is going to be the most important domain for warfare and control of the globe in the 21st century, the information age. The Chinese have, after studying American literature, have recognized this, and they have a clear plan not to go under the US subjugation, and they have a plan in turn wherein they have invested into certain critical technologies which they see as what will project Chinese power and help them reach economic supremacy. Next slide. So there, the digital Silk Roads, I've put, when you say e-governance, smart city, telecom, 5G, what have you, all that is part of the ICT, the information sphere, which spreads across India as a blanket, which we today see it as a threat, but we do not know what to do. Our entire policies, our digital economy, everything is built on mostly the American internet. When you have pushed your entire economy into a digital space, you do not have your own indigenous appliances. You do not have the hardware or the software. You have been colonized. You can always be pressurized. You can always be, and the data which flows, you can never, even if you create a law, there is no way you can ensure compliance of that law because you have no way of monitoring it. The equipment does not belong to you. Even if the equipment, there is some way of monitoring, that will be by the graphical user interface which the OEM has created for you. You will see what they want you to see. China understands that. And that is precisely the reason they've gone for massive R&D funding into ICT and GNR. GNR is, genetics, nanotechnology research. Okay, these are the fields which they have concentrated on. Next, please. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. A very famous saying. So what are the Chinese trying to do to you? About 4.5 years back, I wrote an article immediately after the CPEC came. I said, there will be war and there will be problems in Ladakh. Chinese aims are not, because China at that time had made a statement saying that if Indians will give concession in the east, we will give concession in the west. That means if you gift Tawang to China, they are ready to talk about concessions in, Leh and Ladakh. So I wrote a piece saying that Chinese know that no Indian government can give a concession in Tawang, a settled area. So they do not want any, they do not want a settlement at this stage because their aims are different. When the CPEC is being built, they would rather want J&K to go to Pakistan, and their actions are therein dictated, and their support for Pakistan is very, very clear. Why would they like J&K to go to Pakistan? Because if CPEC, they need Pakistan, it is better to have J&K with Pakistan. That is their strategic aim, and their aims and their actions can clearly be seen in the last 3-4 decades. We have failed to correctly assess it. Next slide, please. So what is a fight? How do you subdue the enemy without this? You definitely need a great military to protect yourself. But okay, I see these questions popping up. But anyway, let's try and come back to that later. So how are they going to win that particular war? After nuclear weapons have come, no major nuclear weapon state has ever overtly fought a war with its full national might, other than skirmishes. Okay, we have had our skirmishes with Pakistan because the nuclear weapons, no political leader would like to risk a major war to apply their political will, because it can escalate into the nuclear domain. So a skirmish with China, a border skirmish, also a major skirmish can happen, but I doubt whether they will actually come into, Indian hinterland. That's not the aim. Their aim is, like the Americans, they would like to dominate the globe by spread of ICT technologies. As long as what was imperial aims always? To come, rule, establish this, extract resources. If you have a global surveillance network which extends into every home, if you can predict each and every behavior, if you can if you can dissect economies of other nations, and you have a competitive advantage for every trade, or you have got compromat on every leader or bureaucrat or military leader or an intelligence person, where you can bend him to your will with that compromat, why do you need to send in your armies to go and rule the world? You don't need to, because your aim will still be achieved. That is what the US is trying to do, and achieved quite successfully quite a bit. And China wants to replicate the same. Next slide. So I have also covered our Indian IT industry and why we have not grown beyond the ITES industry to a actual strategic domain in ICT. That is our own products, both hardware and software, because it is being carefully curated by people who do not want it to be India to have that particular capability. So unless our national leadership, our military, our intelligence agencies, our bureaucracy understand where we have been trapped and try to put pressure, try to push for creation of this ICT industry, we will not be able to compete with either China or the US. Next slide, please. Now, I've put this other slide. Now you clearly see where is India and where is China as far as the wealth percentile is concerned. Now, what quarrel can the Chinese population have with a regime which has ensured that poverty is more or less wiped out in China, and most of them have gone into the middle income? It is a fallacy when we say it is authoritarian. The Chinese regime exists with the full support of the Chinese majority of the Chinese population. Very clear here. If you look at India, our challenges are, we are still, economically, the vast majority of our population have not got the benefits of Indian democracy or the Indian Republic. That is a challenge. Now, if you look at North America, they definitely are one of the richest nations in the world. But if you compare that particular graph at the left top corner, their challenge is there is a sizable percentage of population which is poor, which is missing in China. Okay, next slide. Now, what are our challenges? When you look at the history of the world and the rise and fall of nations and civilizations, three things count: external pressure, internal disturbance, and catastrophic climatic change. External pressure, we are seeing both our borders are contested by two nations who are both revisionist, declared revisionist policy. Internal pressure is this particular youth bulge. This population dividend, if they do not find jobs, is the largest and the most strategic threat to Indian national security. In addition to this very young population, we also do not have any privacy law. Most of our social media and where the data flows takes place can easily be curated to create disturbances within this population, especially if they are not gainfully employed. This is our biggest national security challenge. Next slide. there you are. Now these slides I could only capture because I wrote that book, like I told you, last year. So I had the data which what I could get was of 2018. This would not look so comfortable today if you get accurate data. Next slide. So the demographic dividend, what historically has been calculated, that's our demographic dividend, that period of, in this years where we need to get our act together. So we also face a problem of robotics and AI, which is going to change the entire manufacturing sector of the world. The whole global economy is being planned to be changed by the Great Reset into a paradigm where the jobs might be difficult, is what we are being told. I do not know how it will go because future is very difficult to predict, but we have a problem. Next slide. So what is the solution? In my last paragraph, I've said we need to create an innovation economy, because what is our strength? We've got the largest trained manpower in the globe on ICT technologies. Today, all these this trained manpower are working for Western and foreign corporations. We also send the best and the brightest are educated on our taxpayers, on the taxpayers' credit, and sent abroad. Their aspirations are to go abroad and start earning in dollars. And the Indian nation is happy with a little bit of, money order they send back to India. But would that suffice? Can this youth bulge go across to the globe where the whole globe is becoming protectionist, where AI and robotics are going to change the entire manufacturing, process, the economic order? No, we'll have to plan for it. And we need to break out of bureaucratic control for this. Why does India? It is not that the Indian population or the Indian, talent are inferior to China. What China has done is they have created an educational and economic system where their population's creative talent can be used for adding on to Chinese power. In India, we have created a disincentivizing system. The best and brightest of India go into our IITs and all our premier institutions, and they try to migrate abroad to serve other economies, or they take up jobs in multinational firms which have opened up in India. Do they contribute other than the salary to the Indian, I would say to the Indian economy? Yeah, they do contribute salaries, but the basic profits, everything goes to someone else. Their talent is not being utilized. So how do you do that? Why it is happening is because unwittingly our bureaucracy controls all taxpayers' money. They are very, very reluctant to let go of that control. They have created a vast array of public sector units wherein they themselves go on cross postings and enjoy the benefits of this public sector. This particular R&D edifice where CSIR, DRDO, and the public sector, DPSUs, etc., are the biggest drag on Indian innovation. They curate policies in such a way that we will never succeed. So I have proposed a strategic venture capital fund, which many other nations have done. Whatever be their system of governance, be it capitalists or communists or socialists, whatever they are, the successful ones have all followed this particular because no government civil servant or a bureaucrat can take a decision to back up a particular company and bet on it. The reason is the best of the venture capital funds, their success rate is 10%. That means out of every 10 companies which a venture capital after due diligence will plan to invest in, only one will succeed. No bureaucrat will take this decision because he doesn't want to, be gotten after by the CBI and the CVC and spend this instead of earning a pension going and facing cases. The rest of the world has realized this. So what have they done? They have ensured venture capital companies which are funded by the taxpayer. That particular company, if, for example, I take the example of In-Q-Tel, a very famous American, CIA fund. which a lot of Indians aspire for. Okay, I learned it because I'm sitting here in Bangalore. At a certain point of my time, I realized the best and the smartest guys are trying to get InQtel funding, a CA fund. And that fund has got a very clear this. Any technology or company they invest into has to benefit the security of the US. And that's a blank check. The rest of the venture capital fraternity, second, the InQtel decides to make a strategic investment, they know this company is not going to fail. And for every dollar the US government puts in, or the InQtel puts in, the rest of the venture capital, they proudly announce will put in $9 more. That is how they create their public sector. And why do I call it their public sector? Because they are all privately owned. They have got clear methods of ensuring that those companies cannot be bought by anyone else. That is what is public sector. We spend a whole lot of money and create behemoths which continue to drain our exchequer. We need to rethink. We need to change our entire edifice, R&D edifice. Next, please. So there you have Clausewitz, the decisive act of judgment, which our statesmen and journalists need to exercise, is to understand the war in which he engages. That war is not happening the way we think on the LAC. That is just the sign of conflict. The actual conflict is happening far inside us in our hinterland. And we have not even recognized it. A lot of people have not even recognized what is the fight all about. Although our political leader, Prime Minister has declared Atmanirbhar as a strategy. But what does Atmanirbhar involve? How will it become an effective this to ensure that the Indian economy and Indian innovation ecosystem will grow? I finished. Next slide. So those are my coordinates. If you would like to write to me, I am open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavitran. I think the complete book cannot obviously be understood in just a matter of 1 hour, though you tried to put everything across. I know it was more about what you have written in the book and what your understanding was in terms of engaging China, which is an important aspect of us. But the second part is also extremely important in terms of in the information age, what are India's interests? So we are very happy that you have outlined the entire the schematic diagram of this. What appeals to me is that you have brought it out in different sections of your book, perhaps. But on engaging China, obviously it cannot be on their terms. We all are very clear. I know, even including you, it cannot be on their terms. So even your suggestion about instead of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, I always call it the China-POK economic corridor, and not CPEC, because it legitimizes the occupation of CPEC by China. So even if you try to, let's say, theoretically allow them to have access to both Arabian Sea and the, let's say, the Bay of Bengal through Indian territory, it is not going to sell. For one simple reason, the money has already been invested in the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and they are not now going to say, okay, now is that you are suddenly becoming very receptive to opening up some kind of alternate routes to the sea, we will abandon CPEC. That will not happen. I am sure that you are as clear as me on this issue, that having sunk in so much of money, where it also has a strategic angle, they're not going to come to terms on this. So this so-called initiative to say, we will negotiate the West when you give us the East is a non-starter. So we have come a long way in terms of trying to understand China. So it's from that point of view, I think that there is a lot that we do not understand about China. And the corollary of that is, therefore, we also have not understood anything about our own policies, which is another point that comes out very clearly in your book, particularly towards the end when you quoted Atmanirbharata. What does Atmanirbharata mean? How are we going to take this forward? How many venture capitals do you require for making this happen? And what kind of reformations are required in the public sector undertakings? Or they continue to be white elephants, who have their order books full for next 20 years and, bleed the government? Or are we going to become more competitive on this? So there are huge challenges in the information age that you are talking about. And to my understanding, from your presentation, what is clear to me is that all the information that is available from behind the bamboo curtain is something that we need to access. Because it's only when you understand your adversary through all the means that are available, through your diplomatic missions, through your spies, through their own actions in other countries, through their responses to your actions in your own country, only then we can perhaps decipher, that in context to the information age where you are trying to bring about that correlation. So this is what I understood. I could quite be wrong in trying to, interpret your book, because I have not read the book yet. But this is what I feel, and these are my responses to say that we have an adversary who appears to be beyond comprehension, but it is not so. It's well within the capability of Indians to decipher China, but I don't think we applied our heart and soul into it. Because all this while, we also made the same mistake that USA and the European countries made, which is they give China a chance to integrate in the global economy, give them a chance to become responsible members in the global governance systems, and you have a good nation out there. China is not going to play by the rules of the international system. It's very simple. They are going to play according to the rules that they have formulated, which is actually the CCP Bible. So the Chinese system with special characteristics is what they will promote. And she has already given an order to say that the Chinese dream and the Chinese message should be sold. I think we mentioned it last time. So I am not too confident that we have all the cards in our pocket today to deal with China. But I am optimistic, because India has a very very positive system. If you could take on the Chinese in 1962, you can imagine that we are much more capable. The reason why today China is a little rattled is it appears that their calculations have gone awry. Whether it's the Trans-Himalayan transgression, or the technology warfare that's been launched against them, or the denial regimes that are hitting them from one end to another, or the decoupling initiatives that are coming to force, it's something phenomenal. So no, China is not that is invincible. And I think perhaps they also failed in following the scriptures of Sun Tzu, who's and others in letter and spirit. They did follow this, bide for time and build your strength to a large extent. But here, perhaps after COVID, they did not bide for time in terms of launching their initiatives and offensive. These I thought were my first thoughts before we throw it open to the questions. Bala will control the question answer session, and the rule is that nobody will have the mic, and all the questions will only be put in the chat box. This is in the interest of time, and they will all be clubbed together so that you can take them on, make a note of it, and respond to them together, so that we have more time for having some kind of a collective response from you on different issues. Because the book is yours, the narrative is yours, the presentation is yours, but the questions will be from the audience who would like to understand, why you said A or B or C, and what is the correlation. Over to Bala for getting all the questions together and putting them across to the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm just proceeding with the Q&A session, sir. The first question is by Mr. KV Thomas. He has asked, as regards to your interpretation of history with Chinese culture and system, can you clarify as why the West, especially the USA, failed to break mainland China through their various strategy? Isn't it a mere simplification to hold that US intended disintegration of China, allowing them to become rich and join the band of affluence of the South? Is it more right to interpret that the communist ideology intensively pursued and implemented with iron hand by CCP and leaders like Mao? That which is
I
proven.
suggest put all the questions together, Bala, so that the responses can be clubbed together wherever they are correlated. It will be easy for him, but also for us.
Okay. So
Yes,
the first question about what is the aim of the West in allowing integration of China into the global system? There's adequate material on it. Why did the West allow integration of China? It started off by under the Nixon presidency, when when the Secretary of State flew to China and they opened up, okay, and they said, okay, let us engage with China. Now it is also it is not that China immediately embraced capitalism. When you look into the literature, the Chinese Communist Party was also afflicted by dogma. It is only Deng who pressed for opening up. In fact, he had to bypass the Politburo because the Politburo never gave him permission to open up China the way he did it. So he said his great journey south. He went to the coastal areas, directly dealt with the equivalent of state governments and said, open it up. They also had a vast public sector which was not working. He weaponized it because human nature being same and the bureaucracy being same everywhere. China has got a much more stronger, older and more resilient bureaucracy than India. Now, he allowed the bureaucracy to go corrupt and gain out of this particular thing. Overnight, the bureaucracy allowed investment to pour in because they were gaining out of it. He clearly made a policy saying that we will not take excess tax revenues. We will seal the tax at this level. Next 3 years, profit, whatever you make is yours, which can be utilized by you in the province. So the bureaucracy worked overnight. I'm not saying they directly took money and put it in their pocket, but like usually what happens, all the development which happened was all by the relatives of the bureaucracy. Okay, that money stayed out there. They developed the whole place. It continues today. That's why China is considered highly corrupt, because the whole system worked on, making a policy initiatives to the nature of man, other than dogma, which otherwise dominates the communist thought process. Now, I only interpret why didn't the West do the same for India? In spite of the rhetoric in the last 4 or 5 years, there has been no major shifting of jobs into India. In fact, a friend of mine told me that in Tirupur, which was a manufacturing hub for textiles, which people in Chennai will be able to relate to quite a bit. The Westerners used to do intrusive checking. Even if someone's son or child was playing around in that factory, they used to say, "Oh, this is child labor," and they used to seal it, and they used to put up this. This was not applied to China largely. Okay, they never looked at the labor conditions of China. They allowed it to happen. Why? 2 reasons. One is they wanted China to, grow. And they clearly said that when China grows and becomes affluent, the Communist Party will lose its grip. So my interpretation from a geopolitical, this is the divisions of the coast and the hinterland historically, which is seen. Okay, that is one part. The other is the Chinese Communist Party are also, examined Western interests. They reached out to their businessmen and ensured that such questions were not raised. Even today, okay, although the great decoupling is talked about, nothing much is happening on ground. Okay, these are the facts of the case. Because people would like to continue to make money. Yeah, at certain places, in certain sectors, the Americans are talking about technological decoupling. They have not gone for full decoupling from China. I hope that answers, the question which is asked. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'll just go with a compilation of all the questions so we can take it in one go, sir. Is it fine with you, sir?
As long as they are related and I don't get overwhelmed. I'm not a guy who can remember a lot of things at once.
Sure, sir.
But fair enough.
The next question is by Dr. Vamadev from Kathmandu. He has asked, as India and South Asian countries have talented manpower, why are we still lack to proceed towards knowledge economics via IT? Could you suggest on it for obtaining collective welfare?
Yes, I have examined it and I've also commented on it. We have inherited a bureaucracy which was there from the British. Okay. And that bureaucracy was trained from day one to extract wealth and control populations. In fact, they were active, this for the British divide and rule. So I have heard it multiple times and I've seen it also, that the prevailing wisdom in the people who control the money, the IAS, okay, they control all places where money, is supposed to be expended, an IAS guy will come and sit there. Their predominant this is, agar humne nahi kiya, baki log bikri karke kha jayega. So that they have put it on themselves that if we don't control the money, the rest of them will sell it off and take it off. That a percentage of them also continue to eat is a different matter, and they don't allow powers to grow. Like I clearly mentioned, that if a engineering college principal has got powers to spend 500 rupees official money, and he has to go to the ministry every time, and he has to please the entire ministerial staff for getting even a small things done, you can understand the sort of leadership he will provide to his rest of the faculty. So I'm sure that same thing is happening in Nepal too. So unless you get the iron grip of the the bureaucracy away from public funds, our citizens are not ab initio trusted. In in other countries, all citizens are trusted unless he proves to be otherwise so. Our system works on a default untrust, which I feel must have been inherited from colonial times. Thank you.
Thank you. So next question is by Mr. KV Thomas. He has asked, so your SWOT analysis of Indian scenario, especially the role of youth generation, I think he means the demographic dividend, related to internal security may be sound, but their role has been interpreted by leading economists like Dr. Amartya Sen, Dr. Bhagwati, etc., as an added advantage to take India as a major power by 2050. Hence, as a work like this, instead of narrowing youth power from the point of view of internal security, maybe discuss broad base to effectively use it for larger interests of the nation.
Okay. So I by no stretch of imagination is an economist at the level of Amartya Sen or Bhagwati. I have just applied common sense and I've said a population dividend is so if the economy grows rapidly. That's a very easy deduction even a self-taught little bit of economists like me can make. Now, if you do not have adequate growth and job generation, that youth dividend is a youth bulge. This I can very clearly say. Historically, where there is a youth bulge, and if they are not correctly employed, usually there are chances of revolution. This historically we can always see, and I can very confidently make that assertion. I'm not saying revolution is around the corner, but internal disturbances, especially when you do not have control over our social media, where the youth can share ideas, do things rapidly beyond what the rest of society or our law enforcement mechanism can control. It's a cause for concern. I just flagged it in that way. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Mr. Danesh. He has asked, if India by chance behaved like China, will Western powers be pressurizing us or take advantage of us?
Okay, in what way is that behavior is what is needed? Because China behaves in a multitude of ways, and it is very clear they have benefited from whatever they have behaved for themselves. We might continue to keep saying no, China is good. All parameters show China is doing wonderfully for themselves, and the Westerners and people have opened up their purses and they are gained from it and partnered with them. So I don't know in what way China has got harmed.
The next question again is by Mr. KV Thomas. He has asked, this relates to the technological advancement of China in the areas of artificial intelligence and robotics. Do you think our innovation in these areas are matching or potential to counter the threat of China? This area needs more detailed discussion, especially in the light of Mossad using artificial intelligence to strike their potential rival, as they had done in the case of the Iranian nuclear scientist.
So, in one word, I can tell you, we are nowhere near China. Okay, and the reasons are structural. If you look at China, where is in AI, what is needed is data flows, huge and humongous data flows. Okay, and where are these data flows? They come out of your mobile ecosystem. They come out of your IoT. They come out of your operating systems. These are the places from where they'll get their data flows. The Chinese are able to do it successfully, not only in China, but outside China, even in India. Our entire system feeds data to the West and China. Now, you might take a little bit of it, have a, you might say that, okay, we have got the talent. Where is the data flow? You don't have the data flow to compete against China. You need to structurally change. We need to have our own operating systems for our mobiles, for our desktops, our IoTs. We need to have laws which says localize. That's the only way. Okay, otherwise we can't compete. Very clear.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Mr. Murugan Yadav. He has asked, what are the current strategy or policy framework used by India to counter the emanating threats and challenges from China's information warfare strategy? What will be the future of these information warfare?
Okay, so Chinese information warfare strategy is not particularly directed at India per se. They have got global aims. Okay, and I think in that aspect, Chinese, although they get our data because they sit on our, a lot of apps have been taken off, but our, broadband infrastructure of BSNL, okay, most of the private operators lease it from them, are on Chinese Huawei. Now, with all the evidences till date, to think the Chinese will benignly be allowing India to benefit out of it and they are not putting their hand in would be very, very myopic. But the apps have been taken away by the government. That has stymied them. But if you look at the phones, okay, there are two places from where the data, three places from where the data goes. One is the operating system, which is dominated by the US, largely Android and iOS. Then are the apps. The Chinese apps have been taken off. Now in the smartphone ecosystem, there is also an OEM layer who gets the apps, who gets the data. So the Chinese are there everywhere. We are now got a PLI policy where we're going to subsidize Chinese people who are going to assemble phones out here. So I doubt whether our strategy is correct. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pavitran. There's one last question. As Western nations has started strict action on Huawei and other digital signature of China, in post-COVID world, how does Chinese digital Silk Route will look like?
I'm usually very reluctant to predict things. Okay, there is talk of decoupling. If you look at Huawei, many nations have said they will not allow to be participated. They will not allow Huawei participation. In India, we have also taken such a stand, not overtly, but we have said. But in our study groups, Huawei is there. There's no Indian company which DOT has invited for 5G. Okay, that is where we are, in spite of whatever is happening on the LAC. So how will it look? Because for African countries, third world countries, etc., whether be it US hegemony or Chinese hegemony, it is just who will offer the better terms. But for India, because of our very size, we don't have that option. When China looks at India and the US looks at India, we are the only a large enough nation which has got the heft to take on China. But if you look at India under one political authority, with no first island lines to control us or second lines to control us, with full access to the Indian Ocean, which dominates the sea trades of communication, will the West allow just rise like that with no handle on us? I doubt. We need to carefully understand this. Now, I also jump into Commodore Watson's observation. So in my book, how do we engage with China? I have given a suggestion, because when I see the current intractable relation and our stated geopolitical aims of China and India, it leads to war. And that war is favorable to many other nations. Okay, that conflict is favorable to many other nations. Yes, China is already committed money into CPEC. But so have we committed into our public sector units, and we are trying to do perestroika. Okay, because we realize it's not going anywhere. So it's just an option. It is not a prescription. It's an option which needs to be explored. There is no policy, there is no law, there is nothing which is set in stone. Everything is depending on circumstances and time. It might not happen today, but it might become more attractive tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Before we wind up the question and answer session, one last question by Mr. Arjun Gidwani. Sir, can you shed a little light on the NGO Vidhi's involvement in framing the new data privacy laws?
Okay, Arjun Gidwani has come to the heart of the matter. Okay, my knowledge is also as limited to the newspapers which he is reading and the news articles which have come out. But with the reputation of calling a spade, let me also communicate this back to the community which might not have read it. What has come out so far, this privacy debate, the privacy laws or data protection, what is called today, when it has become the fundamental right of Indian citizens, has upset the apple cart of whole lot of multinationals whose combined, market capital is more than the Indian GDP. Okay, and we are freely allowing this data to flow. They have put in humongous amount of money to ensure this particular debate is as confusing as possible, because they are the biggest. If privacy is a fundamental right, and if the Indian nation is to enforce this privacy for its citizens, these huge companies are the ones who are going to lose. It has also got a strategic aspect. It has also got an economic aspect. This is one of the most valuable resources in the world. So when this particular case for fundamental rights, Puttaswamy judgment was being, there were certain lawyers from certain NGOs, which I don't name, which you can usually find out, who are arguing against the fundamental right for privacy. When the Supreme Court ruled that, yes, there is a fundamental right to privacy, the same lawyer was there in the committee. Till yesterday, he was arguing against privacy. Now he is part of the committee to frame the privacy bill. We also realize that the ITES industry, where people have gone rich, they are the chief funders of this NGO. Their aims are very clear. They have only got one aim. Like all human aims, we are selfish animals, except for certain exceptional people. Their self-interest. They are funded. The who is who of the ITES industry has funded this NGO. And there is also one more interesting name which has come. The Om Diyar Foundation is also funding them. So I leave it to your wisdom. First, they oppose the law. Second, it becomes the law. They are the ones who are drafting the law. There is a clear conflict of interest. And it is not only the money I am worried. I am okay with people earning money, but this is a national security crisis. And we are not addressing it properly. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Last two quick comments by Shri Sridharan sir, member C3S. He has said, Mr. Pavitran Rajan sir says that Chinese actions are not aimed at us, but it is a fallout of US-China issues. In my opinion, it is simply not true. The Chinese always have multiple aims whenever they launch an initiative. Even if tactically they may be looking at USA, strategically they know that a time will come when India would be the competitor. Under the guise of taking on, they are also taking on India right now. This is two birds in one stone. And the second one on IT, it is not as though the USA has stopped us from moving to higher levels such as making products. There is no conspiracy here. Some products made by Indian companies have been successful, though a handful. The initiative has not come from the Indians. We are just happy with what we have got. This is a huge inertia.
So there is no question. It's just an observation. I welcome it. Contrarian views are always welcome. Mine is mostly being contrarian through its evolution. So it's an observation. I commend him for its observation. Let people debate and let people look into what might be more pressing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for patiently taking all the questions. May I now request Ms. Shivani to present the vote of thanks, please?
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon to one and all. It gives me immense pleasure to deliver the vote of thanks in the conclusion of the C3S institutional dialogue on engaging China, Indian interest in information age. At the outset, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to our speaker for the day, Mr. Pavitran Rajan, for accepting our invitation to share his inputs with us all. I take this opportunity to thank Commodore R.S. Vasan, Director C3S, for his support in helping make this event possible. I thank our esteemed members of C3S for bringing valuable discussion to the table and enlightening us during the event. I would like to thank all those who have participated in this C3S institutional dialogue and made this event both productive and engaging. I also place on record my appreciation to C3S team consisting of Mr. C. Balasubramanian and Ms. Aishwarya S. Menon for all the support rendered by them to make this event a success. Thank you all once again and Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir, for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavitran. It was lovely interacting with you. I'm sure we'll have more such sessions. And I'm sure that the youngsters who are here would have made note of all the observations and questions. And each of the question or whatever point has been raised itself becomes a topic for conversation. And we'll take that up in the course of our activities. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Thank you for joining, sir.
May I request the C3S team to stay back?
Yes, sir.
Okay.